All right, guys, this begins Unit 5 Key Concept Review. We're going to focus this lecture on Key Concept 5.1. And 5.1 states that it focuses on industrialization and global capitalism. Key Concept 5.11 states industrialization fundamentally changed how goods were produced. The first subconcept A states a variety of factors led to the rise of industrial production, including. So what you want to be able to do is be able to identify or explain what led to industrialism, especially in England. And what I focus would be geography. Europe, especially England, they're on the Atlantic Ocean, they're close to ports, transatlantic trade. Also rivers and canals to help move goods up and down from, say, cities like Paris or London. And they had raw goods, right? Coal, iron, timber. And then when it comes to, they had large populations that would be used to obviously fill jobs and factories, cities where you would build these factories. And also, not only did you have industrial innovation, but you had agricultural innovation that helped increase productivity, which led to population growth. And then, economically, government was very friendly to business. They would protect property. There was also a lot of access to foreign resources, foreign raw materials. And finally, there was a lot of wealth, capital, which would be used to invest in factories. So you want to be able to kind of use a few of these and think of them as, geographic factors, demographic or population factors, and those natural resources. Subconcept B states the development of machines, including steam engines and the internal combustion engine, made it possible to exploit vast new resources of energy stored in fossil fuels, specifically coal and oil. The fossil fuels revolution greatly increased the energy available to humans. So notice that these terms are underlined: steam engines, combustion engine, coal and oil. Those are the important, not only machines, but the natural resources that are going to be used to propel industry. And you might want to give some specific examples. For example, James Watt develops the first steam engine in the United States. Eli Whitney, he was also the creator of the cotton gin, but his probably most important innovation are the interchangeable parts that were used to put, a product together that would later result in more job specialization on a factory or an assembly line. And finally, in the second industrial revolution in the late 1800s, we're going to see John D. Rockefeller innovate or refine oil and turn oil into petroleum. So again, these are the keywords you want to remember. These are the new machines, and then the resources, the energy resources that were necessary. So again, these are more factors that led to the Industrial Revolution. All right, subconcept C states the development of the factory system concentrated labor in a single location and led to an increasing degree of specialized labor. So there's another factor, right? You're building factories. You're putting people to work in a factory with specialized jobs. That's where interchangeable parts came, or the assembly line helped. Understand that the factory system replaces the putting out system. So before the factory system, people are working at home. They're given materials, they sew clothing, and then that clothing is then sent back to the manufacturer. Well, under the factory system, those workers are taken out of their home and they're put again into a factory to work. Much more efficient. And the enclosure movement was very important. We're going to talk about that later, where the English government started to almost kick off squatters or leasers, and that land was sold to large farms, and those farms were enclosed. So what's the effect? Many poor farmers, farm laborers are going to be unemployed, and they're going to go move to the cities and take these jobs in the factory. So the putting out system and the enclosure movement are or the end of the putting out system. The factory system and the enclosure movement have a lot to do with growing industrialization as well. Subconcept D states as the new methods of industrial production became more common in parts of northwestern Europe, they spread to other parts of Europe and the US, Russia, and Japan. So what you want to be able to do is identify the other parts of the world that were industrializing and perhaps give some examples of that. This is a huge change. Japan's going to go from being isolated during the Tokugawa dynasty to an industrial or more westernized society during the Meiji Restoration, right? The factory system is going to spread to the United States when an Englishman named Samuel Slater moves here and starts building factories. And Russia, under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, we're going to see, more westernization, more industrialization. But it's also important to know that they built a railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, under Nicholas later on, and that's going to help Russia become a major steel and coal exporter. I've seen the Trans-Siberian Railroad on the exam, or it's just I've definitely seen questions about the changes occurring in Russia during this time. And again, I think you start with Peter, and then you move on to Alexander, and then Nicholas, who again builds the railroad. And we'll talk about Alexander in a little bit. Subconcept E. A second industrial revolution leads to new methods in the production of steel. Notice I underline that. Chemicals, electricity. Notice I underline that too. And precision machinery. So basically, we want to understand in the late 19th century or late 1800s, it's the John D. Rockefellers who are going to emerge, and they're going to really, again, come up with new methods. Of producing, in this case, petroleum, right? We know Andrew Carnegie was the steel magnate. He innovates the Bessemer process, which actually is the process to turn iron into steel. He didn't invent that process. He made it better. So steel is going to be a new material, and again, through innovation, it's going to be cheaper and easier to make. And then there's the combustible engine, very important, a more modern engine that's going to replace the steam engine. And then new business methods like monopolies, Rockefeller and Carnegie's, large corporations. And then you can't forget about Edison and electricity that transforms, pretty much the world. Okay, so definitely remember some of these important aspects to the second industrial revolution. Again, that's going to happen as we get closer to the 1900s. All right, key concept 5.12 continues the industrial era theme. It states new patterns of global trade and production developed and further integrated the global economy as industrialists sought raw materials and new markets for the increasing amount and array of goods produced in their factories. Notice I underlined raw materials and new markets. So as the British started to expand, even the United States, the Japanese, they needed to go outside of their boundaries to find more coal or other products like cotton, especially for the English, and also a place to sell their finished goods, those goods that were being made in factories, were used to purchase finished goods. So basically, you want to be able to identify some of the products that were coming out of Africa or Asia. And again, those products or those raw goods were sold to Europe in return or in exchange of those finished goods in Europe. Europeans would obviously use these goods in their production. So, for example, cotton is coming out of India. It's going to be used to in the use of in manufacturing textiles in England, for example, and then those textiles would be sold to markets in India. We know sugar was a main export of the Caribbean that would be used for many things in both the United States and Europe. And then diamonds from Africa. I think that's a really easy one to remember, right? That's an important natural resource that maybe wasn't used for manufacturing, but obviously was used, as a luxury item. So definitely be able to understand where some of these goods are, what are these goods and where are they coming from? Export economies. Subconcept B, very important here. I would definitely remember this concept. It's very possible I've seen it on past tests. So basically, subconcept B states the rapid development of steam-powered industrial production in European countries, and the U.S. contributed to the increase in these regions' share of global manufacturing, while Middle Eastern and Asian countries continued to produce manufactured goods. These regions' share in global manufacturing declined. And what you want to remember is, as manufacturing increased in France, Germany, England, manufacturing declined in India, mostly because of the British government limiting manufacturing in India, for example. So these are industries that were in decline in those colonies or outside of Europe. And that obviously was hurting local artisans or workers who were basically out of a job. So basically, England was kind of pulling all the resources out and limiting the local population from manufacturing those goods. So these colonies or regions became dependent on Europe. So, for example, the shipbuilding industry in India and Southeast Asia was in decline. Ironworks in India, textile production in India and Egypt was in decline because of this European monopoly. So you definitely want to remember this. This is kind of a negative effect of industrialization, not on Europe, but on pretty much the rest of the world, especially in Asia and the Middle East. All right, subconcept C states the global economy of the 19th century expanded dramatically from the previous period due to increased exchanges of raw materials and finished goods in most parts of the world. Some commodities gave merchants and companies based in Europe and the US a distinct economic advantage. So again, what is happening is raw materials are being pulled out of the colonies or other parts of the world. They're being used to manufacture or produce finished goods. And again, that's weakening the local regions. Wealth is being taken out, raw materials are being taken out. In a way, nothing's being put back in. So, for example, opium was being produced in the Middle East, and then the English or the East English, the English would then export that opium to China, and we know how that hurt the Chinese through drug addiction. Cotton would be grown in South Asia or Egypt, India or Egypt, and the Caribbean. Even North America, it would be then exported to Great Britain and other European countries. Palm oil, again, coming out of Africa, exported to European countries, and copper is coming out of Chile and the Western United States. So again, these are commodities, kind of not that different than some of these raw materials too. So it's just kind of an extension of that. All right, subconcept D, the need for specialized and limited metals for industrial production, as well as the global demand for gold, silver, and diamonds as forms of wealth led to the development of extensive mining centers. So again, try to remember, again, this would be a commodity or a raw material that's coming out of Africa. Minerals, metals, and gold and silver and diamonds were the most luxurious or precious of those metals. Cecil Rhodes, I would remember him. He is the founder of De Beers Diamonds, and he actually had this idea to build a rail system connecting South Africa to Cairo to help pull out those resources. So, there's no really specific, historical mining center, but understand what Rhodes' goal was. Again, to mine those resources and get them out of Africa and pretty much to Europe or Egypt and then to Europe. All right, key concept 5.1.3 states to facilitate investment at all levels of industrial production, financiers developed and expanded various financial institutions. So we're kind of focusing here on finance, banking, investment. All right, so subconcept A states the ideological inspiration for economic changes lies in the development of capitalism and classic liberalism associated with Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Notice their names are specifically referenced. That means that the odds or chances of seeing them on the exam are very high. So you want to know who they were and why they were important. So a couple terms or ideologies that are important would be the idea of capitalism. That is also mentioned here. So again, be familiar with that term. It's private ownership, right? This is something that is fairly new. The opposite of capitalism would be a state-sponsored industry or a communist society. Capitalism would be private ownership of not only the means of production, the factories, but also privately owned corporations and smaller businesses. But the key word is private ownership, right? Very little government interference in the economy, very little. In our country today, there is some government interference in the form of taxes, regulations, but for the most part, we're a very true capitalist society. Again, the government doesn't own any of the means of production. They don't own the mines, the factories, right? They don't own really anything in terms of business. They just regulate. Adam Smith, we've studied him, right? Very important philosopher, the founder of modern economics. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, a big supporter of capitalism and free market economies was very against mercantilism. Remember that. Remember, mercantilism is a hands-on policy where you're limiting a colony's ability to trade. Lots of tariffs, lots of restrictions. He believed in laissez-faire economic policy. It's a French term for hands-off, right? Again, limited government intervention. Smith was against tariffs or taxes on goods coming into the country. He was definitely not a huge supporter of lots of regulations and taxes. He believed that markets should regulate themselves through supply and demand. John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian, I can't even pronounce it. I'll get to it in a second, but he was an English philosopher, and he was a big supporter of social reforms to help workers. He was a proponent of labor unions and child labor laws, and his theory was, I think, this idea of I can't pronounce it, but basically he believed that it was up to the government. It was the government's job to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So looking at the majority or looking at the large population, it's up to the government to make sure that that large population was prosperous and, especially economically speaking, right? I think that's the key word, greatest good for the greatest number of people. So more of a reformer, not really an economic, theorist, more of a social reformer, but again, tied into, he was concerned about some of the problems that industrialization was causing, right? Gaps between the rich and the poor, terrible working conditions. And the majority of people in, say, England were workers or farmers. And it was really up to the government to make sure that the greatest number of people were benefiting from economic policies. All right, subconcept B states, the global nature of trade and production contributed to the proliferation, the growth of large-scale transnational businesses that relied on various financial instruments. A transnational business would be a company in a country that does business all over the world, right? So back then, that's not today, obviously, we have thousands and thousands of transnational businesses. But some of the early global businesses or businesses that did, that had there was doing business all over the world, would be the United Fruit Company, an American fruit company based in Guatemala. Eventually, it would be taken over by the Guatemalan government in the 50s. Hong Kong and the Shanghai Banking Corporation, which still exists today, HSBC, was an early banking corporation in China founded by British bankers. Remember, Hong Kong became a British colony after the Opium Wars. Stock markets are examples of people in one country being able to buy and sell stock in a company in another country. For example, you had insurance companies that might have been founded in England but were maybe insuring people in India. And also there were corporations that were growing in size, limited liability corporations, and that's the point of a corporation. Investors come together, they share in the investment, whether it's profit or loss. So you don't have as much liability if you're joined with others. So you might lose something, but you might not lose it all because you're sharing in that risk. So just some kind of new business organizations, and especially remember one of these two transnational businesses, right? An English company that is obviously in another country, or an American company in another country doing business. All right, key concept 5.14 states there were major developments in transportation and communication, including railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and canals. Notice they specifically reference steamships, telegraphs, and canals. So you want to give examples of those, right? So one of the most important railroads during this time was the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia. Don't forget the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. That was also very significant. Robert Fulton designs the first modern steamship to help plantation owners move their cotton up and down the Mississippi River. And it was also used on the East Coast as well. Steamships would travel from New York City to the Great Lakes through the Erie Canal and Hudson River. So that's a great example of a canal. Also the Suez Canal, we'll get to that in a little bit, and the Panama Canal, right? We learned that from U.S. History 1, or U.S. History 2, I believe. Telegraphs are emerging not only in the United States, but in China, the Ottoman Empire, Africa, and India, as were railroads. And again, the purpose of that railroad, at least from England's point of view, was to govern colonies, right? Make it easier to go from one city to another and govern those cities, and also to pull out those resources. Um, this led to a lot of resistance in both China and the Ottoman Empire. Remember, in China we have the self-strengthening movement, which actually wasn't resistance, but it was an attempt to again become more westernized, right? But there was resistance to that movement or westernization in the form of the Boxer Rebellion and Empress Cixi. And remember, people not only in the Ottoman Empire but in China too were upset with extraterritoriality rights. Remember, the English and the Germans would have kind of special rights in the Ottoman Empire and in India. And capitulations. Remember, the Ottoman Empire gave kind of the Germans free rein to go in there and invest and purchase land, and that also led to some resentment on behalf of the Ottoman people. All right, there's the Suez Canal. It was built by the Egyptians in 1859, connects the Mediterranean with the Red Sea, a very important canal even to this day. The English would take it over in 1882. One, they wanted to make sure it would always stay open during some civil war in Egypt. Egyptian laborers or corvée laborers, we've heard that term, right? Unpaid workers, almost slaves. They were used to build that canal. And also we're going to see along with the canal, we're going to see the growth of railroads and steamships in that region as well. And the Panama Canal, right? Teddy Roosevelt initiates construction. Eventually, the people of Panama would take the canal over, but for many years it was part of the United States, or was owned by the United States. And that's going to help travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So definitely remember, one of the three canals, the Erie Canal, the Suez Canal, or the Panama Canal. All right, key concept 5.15, we're almost done. The development and spread of global capitalism led to a variety of responses. Keyword responses, right? How did others respond to capitalism, the good and the bad, especially the inequality that was developing? Subconcept A states, in industrial states, many workers organize themselves. Keyword organized, right? Workers organizing to improve working conditions, limit hours, and gain higher wages, while others opposed industrialist treatment of workers by promoting alternate visions of society, including Marxism. Notice how Marxism is specifically referenced. You have to understand Karl Marx's philosophy, which we know pretty well. Some of these, alternative visions of society were also utopian socialism societies. Remember that? There were Charles Fourier, Charles Owen. They chose to separate from modern society and create these utopian or perfect communal societies where everyone would work together and everyone would be economically equal, right? Charles Owen tried to establish a community in Indiana. It didn't really last very long, but that's an example of utopian socialism. Remember, Marx didn't like that. Marx believed you shouldn't separate, you should try to fight for that income equality. And Karl Marx, right? So I'm not going to get too detailed, but remember his basic philosophy, Marxism, which also produced the ism of communism. Basically, he believed that the workers had to just violently overthrow the owners, right? Remember, socialism had already been in existence. He kind of, he believes that yes, that socialism has some positives, but it's too slow and it's limited. The government only controls the means of production. Communism is complete ownership of all businesses, not by the government, but by the workers. The workers own these businesses, right? They share in those profits. So he's an advocate of socialism, but he believes that you have to become more radical. And so again, the key word is a violent overthrow of the owners. His ideas inspire the Russian Revolution in 1818. We'll talk about that in the next unit. Sorry, 1918, I apologize. And the emergence of Lenin, Nikolai Lenin. And we'll talk more about him down the road. And basically the creation of a communist state, right? Again, the Russian Revolution was a violent overthrow of the owners by the workers. That's Lenin right here. All right, we also, we've learned about the labor movement growing both in the United States and England, right? The emergence of labor unions. They were fairly successful. By 1900, there were minimum wage laws, at least in England. In the United States, during the New Deal, we saw that with Franklin Roosevelt. There were working hour restrictions that was more prevalent in the United States at the end of the 19th century. Also, this led to, not only are workers, they're fighting for minimum wage laws, but they realize that if we really want power, we need more suffrage. So, in the mid 1800s in both the United States and England, you had to own land, and that's going to change. The labor movement led to a suffrage movement for men. It's going to take a while for women, but by 1900, all men could vote, and that eliminated the property qualification. So the labor union movement leads to a voter reform movement. Don't forget Otto von Bismarck. That's the Prussian leader who unifies Germany. And once he's in power, he actually is fearful of the growing labor and socialist movements. And so to kind of calm the workers down and appease them, he does introduce some reforms like workmen's compensation and a worker pension plan. So he did it out of fear, right? Fear of losing power to the working class. But I think that Franklin Roosevelt did that quite a bit too. He recognized that socialism and communism were growing in popularity, and he needed to introduce some reforms too, and he did so in the New Deal. All right, subconcept B, Qing China and the Ottoman Empire. Some members of government, and notice they're both referenced, so be familiar with those empires. Some members of government resisted economic change and attempted to maintain pre-industrial forms of economic production, right? More traditional economies and political systems, while other members of the Qing and Ottoman governments led reforms in imperial policy. So we spent a lot of time on this, right? So Muhammad Ali, he is going to introduce a lot of changes to the Ottoman Empire. Militarily, he's going to transform the Egyptian army into more of a European army. He is going to kind of get rid of those janissaries, and he's going to kind of come up with a paid or conscription army, where he's going to draft men, right? He's going to get rid of the paid soldiers, and he's going to kind of force all men to participate in a conscription plan. He's going to create more secular schools. That's important, right? He's moving away from a state that where religion dominates. He's going to create newspapers, which is very new to the Muslim world at the time. And he's also going to we're going to see state-sponsored industrialization. He's going to build factories to produce military weapons and textiles. He's also going to kind of undermine peasants. He's going to tax them so they give up their land to the government. And then that gave the government control of the cotton production and export of cotton. So definitely, peasants didn't really do well during this time. But overall, he's going to bring more Western industry to this region. When he's gone, other Ottoman leaders are going to introduce reforms, the Tanzimat reforms. We're going to see codified laws, right? That's a change. Laws that are more legal in nature, not necessarily religious or Sharia law. They're going to update the legal system. We're going to see equality for all men. That's a change, right? Especially in education and government. They're going to continue the growing industrialization of the Ottoman Empire, especially in Egypt. They're going to build roads, canals, and railroads. And I always remember the fez, right? It's just to help soldiers pray. So a cultural reform, right? The fez cap. In China, we're going to have the Opium Wars, right? The Chinese are going to rebel against England's opium trade. But that's not going to end well. They're going to lose those wars, and the Treaty of Nanking is just going to open up more ports to China, right? And the English are going to have these special extraterritoriality rights. Hong Kong is also going to be a colony. So the Opium Wars were a major turning point, right? We're going to go from an isolated society to a society that's much more open to westernization. Not on purpose, though, right? It was the war that really opened that up. There was rebellion, right? So the Qing were being criticized for that the Manchurian leaders. So Taipings, or more native Chinese, who were upset with the Manchurian leaders and the results of the Opium War, rebelled. They were also angry that Christian missionaries were denouncing traditions like ancestor veneration and foot binding. So starving peasants, workers, miners, who were distrustful of the Manchurian rulers, joined with Hong Ziquan and led this rebellion. But it was put down by Qing supporters, who believed it was up to them to uphold Confucian values of respect for rulers. And also they had the help of the French and British, who wanted to maintain those open ports, obviously, right? So the Taipings were trying to go back to more, again, traditional ways, right? Frustrated with, the changes that were occurring during the Qing dynasty. Then that follows with the self-strengthening movement. It's a continuation of the westernization of China. In response to not only the violence, but also famine, flood, and plague, leaders of the Qing government tried to innovate or advance their military, right? So the reasoning wasn't necessarily for profits, but it was to defend China against foreign invasion, especially European incursions, right? So manufacturing was focusing on ships, weapons, for example. They did encourage students to leave and learn in Europe and in other places, right? They're also going to, encourage the building of railroads and telegraphs. Then Empress Cixi follows. I forget how to pronounce her name. She's going to try to go back to more traditional ways. She rejects the 100 Days of Reform movement that wanted to build more railroads and put in more telegraph systems. She jails her stepson, and she, again, ends that expansion. She, though, recognizes that there were some problems with the civil service system, and she ends that. So she even introduces some new reforms, but more political reforms, right? She's definitely going to want to isolate China and limit westernization and industrialization. All right. Subconcept C, in a small number of states, governments promoted their own state-sponsored visions of industrialization. We mentioned Muhammad Ali, again, what the government did to build up industry in the Ottoman Empire. Again, there we have canals, roads, and railroads. That's a common theme in all of these places. The Japanese, we're going to see industrialization being sponsored by the Meiji government, the Meiji dynasty, right? Again, they're going to fund training for new workers, not only laborers, but also managers. In the silk and shipbuilding industries, they're going to have technical schools to educate workers, modernize railroads and roads. How are they going to fund this? Taxes on farmers, just like Muhammad Ali did, right? And yes, early on, factories are going to be owned by the government, but eventually those factories will be sold to private owners called zaibatsus. And that's going to result in the emergence of a famous Japanese company, the Toyota Loomworks Company, which later on would be Toyota Automobiles, right? So there was some so they did promote private industry at some point. In Russia, Alexander II, he would be the next Russian leader to remember after Peter the Great. Peter the Great begins the westernization of Europe. Alexander continues that in the mid-1800s. He liberates peasants. He ends serfdom. That's important. That's a big change. Remember, the Russians struggled in the Crimean War, and the Russians blamed the peasants who were just uneducated and really not very westernized and were poor soldiers. So that's going to change the way the Russians do business. He's going to pay for roads and railroads. He's going to subsidize coal and iron industries or promote those industries with government funding. He's going to pay for those things through tariffs to, make goods coming into Russia more expensive, to, protect and stimulate domestic factories. And he doesn't build the railroad, but he initiates the process. But Nicholas, who follows, ends up building the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Definitely remember what's happening in Russia too. We didn't spend a lot of time on it outside of Peter the Great and Catherine, but his reforms are going to continue under Alexander and Nicholas, and that's the key thing to remember. All right, subconcept D. In response to criticisms of industrial global capitalism, some governments mitigated, that means to kind of slow down, the negative effects by promoting various types of reforms. Definitely remember some of the new labor reforms, like minimum wage laws. In England, it's going to happen first, then the United States in the 1930s. 5-day work weeks, child labor laws in England and the United States in the 19th century. So that's going to happen in the late 1800s in the United States. Mandatory education in England, that's going to happen in England before it happens in the United States. And then remember Bismarck's reforms to help workers, pensions, and workmen's compensation laws. If you get hurt, you get paid. If you get hurt on the job, you get paid. All right, key concept 5.16. The ways in which people organize themselves into societies also underwent significant transformations in industrialized states due to the fundamental restructuring of the global economy. So the global economy will change. Notice my enclosure movement picture. That's kind of the clue here. New classes are going to emerge, right? The middle class in Europe is going to emerge. The industrial working class will grow in size. So what are some of the new jobs that are available to more educated Europeans? Well, these factories are going to need managers or accountants. They're going to need an education. So we're going to see improvements in literacy. So again, understand that this middle class is growing because industry is growing. You need more than just the factory worker. The enclosure movement we mentioned is going to spur migration to cities. These farmers who are kind of kicked off, their rental land, they're going to need work, and they're going to find that work in factories. Again, try to understand. That's an important piece, the enclosure movement. So if you don't understand, maybe reread the definition. And in the United States, we're going to see immigration grow, and that's going to help the U.S. industrial working class as well. Don't forget the potato famine, right? Irish are leaving Ireland because the potato crop has been diseased. And to survive, they flee to the United States and find jobs in American factories. New family dynamics, new demographics, new roles for women. The nuclear family, right? We're going to go from, during the putting out system, you might have a home with many children, uncles living in your home. You're all kind of working. On a farm, you're going to have a very large family, again, relatives. But once people move into cities, they're not going to be able to afford a large family. They're not going to have enough space for a large family. So we're going to see more of a modern family emerge, right? A husband and wife, 2 children living under one roof, as opposed to a large family, many cousins, uncles, etc., who were living in rural areas. This nuclear family, more often than not, in the lower class, husband and wife are going to both be working in a factory, as did the children. So that's a good term to remember, the growth of the nuclear family. Middle class women are not going to be working. They're going to be more educated. They're going to be focused on their family, but they're also going to devote their free time to buying things, consumerism, and reform. Especially in the United States, many middle class women became abolitionists. They fought for mental health and temperance. Right? They went after alcohol. Lower class women were mostly working in factories. The cult of domesticity. So this is very important. It is not feminism. It's this belief. It's the continuation of patriarchy in a sense. It's the continuation of traditional women's roles, where a woman should be staying at home and taking care of the kids. This is not feminism. You guys kind of missed that on one of the questions. It's defining the role of a woman in the late 18th and early 19th century. Domesticated goddess in a sense, right? It was good to be a housewife. Take care of your family. It's good for society. Also, in China, as more men migrated or left China, women kind of had to fill some of those economic roles, right? In maybe some of the new factories on farms. So even though it's still a patriarchal society, women had to kind of they saw an increase in maybe more economic opportunity. I wouldn't say political opportunity, but more economic opportunity. Rapid urbanization, right? So as cities are growing, so do terrible conditions. You want to be able to, identify what some of those conditions were. Remember, especially in the United States, immigrants would live in ethnic communities. The apartments would be known as tenements. The neighborhoods would be slums. terrible pollution, crime, dangerous conditions in these factories. Child labor systems continued. Children were mistreated. Life expectancy was very low at the time. Long hours, chemicals, accidents, you name it, very common. I always remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. We studied that freshman year, if you recall, right? The terrible fire in 1911 that was really symbolic of the terrible working conditions in the United States at the time. All right, that's it, guys. 5.1.